For nearly 3 decades, one story has haunted hip-hop like a scar that never fully healed. The night Tupac Shakur was ambushed at Quad Studios in New York City. That night in 1994 didn't just leave Pac riddled with bullets. It ignited the fuse for one of rap's darkest chapters. A storm of paranoia, betrayal, and coast-to-coast hostility that would soon consume the culture. Busta Rhymes wasn't inside Quad that night, but he felt the shockwaves reverberate through the industry. He knew Pac personally, had witnessed that fiery brand of loyalty that defined him, and understood better than most what being symbolized. Now, after decades of silence, he's finally revealing what really happened. Before Busta Rhymes became the explosive solo artist the world knows today, his career was hanging by a thread. In the early 1990s, he was part of Leaders of the New School, a group that seemed destined for greatness in hip-hop's golden era. But behind the scenes, things weren't nearly as smooth as they looked. Busta has admitted that the tension within the group was brutal, especially with fellow member Charlie Brown. It was chaos, and eventually, the chaos caught up with them. Busta found himself pushed out of the very group that had put him on the map, left to wonder if his career was about to collapse before it had even begun. That breaking point came in 1993 while Busta was in Los Angeles. He had landed a small role in John Singleton's Higher Learning and was staying at the Oakwood Apartments, a place buzzing with young actors and artists trying to find their way in Hollywood. It was there, far away from his New York roots, that he got the devastating call. He was officially out of Leaders of the New School. For an artist with so much raw talent, the rejection was crushing. But as fate would have it, he wasn't alone during this dark chapter. His roommates at Oakwood were actor Omar Epps and another young artist still carving his path, Tupac Shakur.
Me, Pac, Omar Epps, we all stayed in those Oakwood apartments.
Living under the same roof during that uncertain time created something deeper than just an industry friendship. Both men were ambitious, both carried heavy burdens, and both were trying to make a name for themselves in the hip-hop world. For Busta, Tupac became more than a friend. He was a lifeline. Tupac had this aura about him, this fiery energy that drew people in, and Busta found himself not just inspired but protected by it. Busta would later go on to say that his relationship with Pac was credible.
But my relationship with Pac was incredible.
One story from those early days shows exactly what kind of person Tupac was and why his bond with Busta ran so deep. Busta has told it many times because it stuck with him forever. Leaders of the New School were booked to perform at a college on the West Coast, but things went sideways before they even got on stage. The group arrived late for sound check, and the sound man, irritated and ready to wrap things up, decided he was done with them. He began shutting down the equipment, basically telling them they'd missed their chance. Most artists would have just accepted the loss, maybe begged a little, maybe argued, but Tupac wasn't built that way. At this point, he wasn't yet the superstar the world would come to know. He was still mostly recognized as a backup dancer for Digital Underground, but that didn't matter to him. What mattered was respect, and when he saw the sound man disrespecting Busta and his crew, he snapped. Busta remembers Tupac charging at the man, grabbing him by the neck, and choking him while shouting, "You're not gonna disrespect Leaders of the New School!" He called them legends, even though they were just a group still trying to find their place in the industry. It wasn't about clout or fame. Tupac's loyalty didn't depend on how big you were. It was about principle. Busta and the rest of the crew had to physically pull Tupac off the sound man, panicking that the whole incident might cost them their performance and their paycheck.
Like even when he got into the beef with the sound check man, we were straining him like my...
But in that wild moment, Busta saw something that defined Tupac's character better than anything else. He realized that Pac's loyalty was fierce, almost reckless, and it wasn't something he gave out selectively. He defended people he believed in, no matter what it cost him. For Busta, this moment became more than just a crazy story. It was a glimpse into the duality of Tupac. That same fire, that same refusal to back down was what made him magnetic and unforgettable. But it was also the very trait that would later put him in situations too dangerous to walk away from. After that unforgettable moment with the sound man, Busta started to notice something about Tupac that made him different from anyone else in the industry. He wasn't just a rapper on the come-up. He was a man carrying both fire and weight on his shoulders. And as the months passed, that fire only grew stronger. By the mid-90s, Tupac's life was moving at lightning speed. The fame, the music, the headlines, it all hit at once, and with it came new battles, new enemies, and new paranoia. For Busta, the role of being just a close friend began to shift. He was still by Pac's side, but now he found himself becoming more of a watchful guardian, a man trying to calm a storm that was growing too big to control. One of the turning points that made this change clear came in 1993, when Tupac went down to Atlanta for an event. At first, it was supposed to be just another wild festival weekend, but Pac never seemed to walk away from an event without some kind of headline. When the news broke, it wasn't about music or women or partying. It was about Pac had been involved in a out with two off-duty police officers who were allegedly harassing a black man. In most cases, something like that could have ended a career instantly. But Pac wasn't most people. The charges were eventually dropped. But what stuck wasn't the case itself, it was the effect it had on him.
Pac got back from that. Pac became super paro because he felt like the cops was going to...
Busta remembers sitting with Tupac after that incident and realizing that something inside him had shifted. Pac was different. He spoke like a man who believed he had a target on his back. He became jumpy, guarded, and convinced that forces beyond his control were moving against him. Paranoid is the word Busta uses, but it wasn't paranoia in the sense of wild imagination. With Pac, there was always some truth in it, because he really did have enemies, and he knew the walls were closing in. But while that fear could have broken another man, Pac turned it into fuel. Busta describes a night where he witnessed something almost impossible. In Tupac's apartment, he watched him sit down with an MPC beat machine, locked in with a single sample from the Isley Brothers. Most artists might make one track out of it, maybe two if they're inspired. Pac made 7.
I literally watched him write about 7 songs to the same Isley Brothers sample.
7 different songs, all to the same beat, each telling a different story. Busta sat there, stunned. He even admitted he got tired of hearing the same loop over and over, but Pac wasn't slowing down. It was as if the paranoia and pressure were pouring straight into his music, creating a flood of ideas no one else could keep up with. It was around this same time that the hip-hop world itself was beginning to fracture. The infamous 1994 Source Awards became the stage for one of those fractures. And once again, Tupac was at the center of it. That night in New York, a Tribe Called Quest were on stage, accepting an award, when the producers made a call that would change everything. They cued Tupac's music, signaling for him to make his entrance. Pac, always locked in on the performance, didn't realize what was happening behind him. He walked out and started his set, completely unaware that he was cutting off Tribe's acceptance speech in front of the whole audience.
So it looked like Pac came out in the middle of the acceptance speech on some them shit.
On the surface, it might have seemed like just another scheduling hiccup, but in the world of hip-hop, respect is everything, and the move was seen by Tribe as a slap in the face. To their fans, it looked like Pac had just stormed the stage, overshadowing one of the most respected groups in the game. Backstage, tempers boiled, words were exchanged, and suddenly a beef was born that nobody had seen coming.
That shit led to instant beef.
This was where Busta's role became crucial. Unlike most, he had ties to both sides. Tupac was his brother-in-arms, the man who once defended him at a sound check with his bare hands. But Q-Tip and Tribe were family too, men Busta described as being like brothers to him. If there was anyone who could bridge the gap, it was him. Tupac, realizing the situation was spiraling, didn't double down. Instead, he went straight to Busta. He explained that it was never intentional, that he was just following the producer's cues, and that he had nothing but deep respect for Tribe, for Tip, for Fife, for everything they represented. He asked Busta to step in, to make sure his words got across, because he didn't want the misunderstanding to poison what should have been mutual love between two giants of the culture. Busta did exactly that. He spoke with Q-Tip, cleared the air, and eventually got Pac and Tip on the phone.
I got them on the phone.
They hashed it out, and for a moment, it looked like one of the biggest potential feuds in hip-hop had been stopped before it ever really started. They even began discussing making a joint appearance on Bet, standing side by side to publicly show the world that there was no bad blood. The plan never came to life because the streets and the industry were moving too fast, and soon, bigger battles would take over. But that moment matters. It shows that at that point in time, even with all the tension and ego, peace was still possible. Conflicts could still be solved through conversation and respect. By the end of 1994, the storm around Tupac had reached a point where even Busta Rhymes, who had always been one of the people trying to calm the chaos, could feel things slipping out of control. The tension in hip-hop wasn't just in the air anymore. It was thick, almost like a fog hanging over every move Pac made. And then came the night that changed everything. The night of November 30, 1994. Pac was headed to Quad Studios in Manhattan, one of the most famous recording spots in New York. He wasn't there for a grand collaboration or some major album work. He was simply doing a feature for a track by Little Sean, collecting $7,000 he badly needed to cover the mountain of legal bills piling up from his assault case. It was supposed to be a quick in-and-out job, another hustle to keep the lights on while his world was spinning. But in hindsight, this was no ordinary studio session. It was a setup waiting to happen. When Tupac and his crew arrived, they saw Lil Cease from Junior Mafia hanging out on the balcony. Cease was Biggie's guy, and that brief exchange gave Pac just enough comfort to push aside his usual suspicion. He'd always lived with a sense of danger, but that night he allowed himself to relax. If Biggie's crew was around, surely this couldn't be a trap. That false sense of safety is what made what happened next feel like a knife in the back. The moment Pac stepped into the lobby, the air shifted. Out of nowhere, masked men appeared, guns drawn, and chaos erupted. In a flash, he was on the ground, fighting for his life. Shots rang out. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Bullets ripped through his body, hitting his hand, thigh, pelvis, and chest. They stripped him of his jewelry, leaving him bleeding and humiliated. Somehow, through sheer willpower, Tupac survived, but the scars went far beyond flesh. To him, this wasn't just a robbery. It was betrayal. In the days that followed, rumors flew like wildfire. The streets whispered names, and Pac started connecting dots in his mind. The fact that the ambush happened inside a studio filled with East Coast figures he knew personally left him convinced it wasn't random. The wound wasn't just physical, it was personal. He believed people he once trusted either had a hand in it or knew it was coming. Years later, Dexter Isaac would confess to being behind the robbery, claiming Jimmy henchman Rosemond had ordered it. But for Tupac in that moment, the blame fell squarely on people far closer to him. While his body healed, his anger boiled. And when he was locked up in Rikers Island in early 1995, he found his stage again, not in music, but in the pages of Vibe magazine. From his cell, he gave one of the most explosive interviews in hip-hop history to journalist Kevin Powell. It wasn't just an interview, it was a declaration of war. Pac named names. He pointed the finger at Biggie, at Puffy, and at others tied to Bad Boy Records. He accused them of knowing about the attack before it happened, framing it as a calculated setup. And he didn't say it like a man speculating, he said it like a man giving his last testimony. Powell recalled Pac telling him, "If I get killed, I want people to have the real story." That wasn't paranoia talking. That was a man who believed he was living on borrowed time, and he wanted to make sure his words would outlive him. For those who had known Pac before, this interview showed a side of him that felt different. He had always been passionate, fiery, and quick to speak his mind, but now there was something darker in his tone. Powell described him as more menacing, more consumed with anger and vengeance. Prison hadn't broken him, it had hardened him. And the words he put out through Vibe weren't just meant for Biggie or Puffy. They were meant for the entire world. This was the turning point. Before the quad shooting, beefs in hip-hop, even the heated ones, still had a chance of being resolved behind closed doors. People like Busta had proven that. He had calmed storms, kept friendships alive, and shown that dialogue could still fix broken bonds. But after Pac's Vibe interview, there was no going back. He had dragged the conflict into the spotlight, carved the battle lines into stone, and turned private tension into a public war. After the Quad Studios shooting and Pac's firestorm of an interview in Vibe, hip-hop was no longer just music, it was war. The streets were buzzing, lines were being drawn, and every lyric, every performance, every rumor had the potential to light another fuse. With Pac now under the death row banner and taking open shots at his former New York allies, the tension was unbearable. The entire culture felt like it was sitting on a powder keg, and any spark could blow it all to pieces. In the middle of it, almost by accident, stood Busta Rhymes. He wasn't waving a flag for one side or the other. Instead, he was trying to hold the center together, and the decision he made during this period showed just how much weight he carried in the game. Busta had been working on a record that he thought would be monumental. He wanted to put together something that would showcase New York's finest, a track that would feature him alongside Nas, Method Man, and Biggie. For the production, he tapped none other than Jay Dilla, who handed him one of those beats that felt larger than life. The idea was to create something timeless, a lyrical showcase that would stamp the East Coast at its best. But everything about the project was difficult from the start. At the time, Biggie was recovering from a near-fatal car accident that had left him in a wheelchair. The first two sessions were a bust because the elevator in the studio was broken, and Big physically couldn't get up there. When they finally moved it to a different spot with better access, Biggie rolled in, larger than life as always, calm and collected. For 3 hours, he didn't touch a pen, didn't write a word. He just sat in his chair, smoking, nodding to the beat, letting it sink into his bones. Then, like it was nothing, he announced he was ready. He wheeled himself into the booth and delivered his entire verse straight from memory. What came out of his mouth was pure brilliance. but it was also dangerous. Right in the middle of his rhymes, Big let loose a shot that wasn't disguised, wasn't subtle, and wasn't meant to be. The lines were aimed squarely at Tupac, mocking his image and everything he stood for. It wasn't just clever wordplay, it was an attack. For Busta, the moment was heavy. On one side stood his brother Biggie, spitting a verse that could set the rap world on fire. On the other stood Tupac, the man he'd broken bread with, laughed with, and defended in countless rooms. He knew what releasing those bars would mean. It wouldn't be just another diss track. It would be gasoline on a fire that was already burning too hot. So Busta made a decision. He turned to Big and told him straight up, "I can't put this out. Pac was my friend too." It wasn't about choosing sides. It was about choosing peace, or at least refusing to feed the war. He saw himself not as a soldier in the beef, but as a mediator, someone who still believed there could be a way to stop the By shelving the record, he might have cost himself one of the greatest posse cuts in hip-hop history. But in that moment, he was protecting something bigger than music. He was protecting lives. The tragedy, of course, was that the bleeding didn't stop. In September 1996, Tupac was gunned down in Las Vegas after a Mike Tyson fight, the drive-by leaving him mortally wounded. He was just 25 years old when he died 6 days later, and the shockwaves ripped through hip-hop. His death didn't just feel like the loss of a superstar. It felt like a confirmation that the East Coast-West Coast rivalry had spun completely out of control. Every rapper, every label, every fan could feel the tension in the air, and Pac's murder stood as a brutal warning of what unchecked beef could cost. Years later, after both Pac and Biggie were gone, the story of that verse came back around. Diddy was putting together Born Again, Biggie's posthumous album, and was hunting for unreleased verses. That's when Busta revealed he still had Big's performance from that night. But he didn't just hand it over, he set conditions. He demanded creative control over how the verse was used, asked for his original $10,000 fee back, and made sure Biggie's mother, Valletta Wallace, gave her blessing. This wasn't about clout or money, it was about respect. When the song finally came together, released as Dangerous MCs, Busta did something remarkable. He went into the recording and surgically removed the parts where Biggie dissed Tupac. He filled the gaps himself, rewriting the energy so that it sounded like him and Big were trading bars back and forth. He turned a direct shot into a lyrical sparring match, preserving Biggie's genius while stripping away the poison. It was an act of love, not only for Big, but for Pac as well. Busta refused to let their legacies be defined by bitterness. Instead, he found a way to honor both of them, reshaping the past so the world would remember their brilliance, not their feud. Looking back, this was Busta at his most powerful, not on a stage, not on the charts, but in the quiet decisions he made when no one was watching. He had the power to escalate the war, to push the East Coast and West Coast further apart. Instead, he chose the harder path, the path of restraint, the path of a mediator. In a time when everyone was picking sides, Busta Rhymes stood in the middle, not to be neutral, but to protect the memory of too many loved. And in doing so, he showed that sometimes the greatest act of strength in hip-hop is knowing when not to let the world hear a verse. From Busta's perspective, Tupac's death wasn't just a random tragedy. It was the inevitable result of a character trait he had seen in Pac for years. An unshakable, almost reckless loyalty. Busta has said that this deep need to prove his allegiance is what ultimately ended up getting him killed. He points to that night in Las Vegas, explaining that Tupac jumped into a conflict that had nothing to do with him personally, but because he was with his crew, Pac felt compelled to ride for them, to show that he would stand by his people no matter what. To Busta, this loyalty was a double-edged sword. On one side, it was beautiful, because you always knew Pac had your back, no matter the cost. But on the other side, that very impulse dragged him into dangerous situations he could have walked away from. In the end, it was this very trait, the refusal to stand down, the need to prove he was all in, that led to the fatal outcome in Las Vegas.